Welcome to the Bureau podcast, and very happy and privileged to have back Adam Zivo, who everyone that follows us knows he's done a lot of great reporting for the Bureau and elsewhere on counter narcotics in Canada. And he's covering a lot of conflict zones around the world. We had him on about a year ago or so when Israel really took care of their together with the United States, did an incredible attack on Iran. And here we are again. So, Adam, you're in Tel Aviv. I've been following and covering the war mainly from American political and military sources. You're going to give a totally closer and different perspective from Israel. So tell us when you got there and how it's looking.
Okay, so I got here about a week before the war began because it was quite clear at that time that conflict was imminent. And my political sources and journalistic sources all warned that should a war start, that the effects on Tel Aviv would be substantial, that the damage would be brutal, that this would be a very difficult time, and that things would be much worse than the 12-day war last June. So I arrived, and there was an odd sense of normalcy in the city, which is actually just the way that Israel works. It's how things normally are. They've been in war for many years, and they've been in conflict with their neighbors for decades. And so people were just living their lives, going to the beach, going to the cafes, working, and they all knew that war was looming in the near future. But at the same time, they said, "Look, what can we do about it? We feel some anxiety, but there's nothing new to this." So then, on Shabbat, which is on a Saturday, when most things in Israel are closed, we all received an emergency alert at 8 a.m. And just to give you some context, the way things work here, at least this is how it worked when I was in Israel last summer, is that you get an emergency alert, which sounds like an Amber Alert in Ontario. It takes over your phone. It's not done through an app. It's done through an emergency system. The blaring is the exact same thing that you would know from an Amber Alert. It's not something you can ignore. And then that will direct you to a bomb shelter. So you should say, you have to, this says find a safe place. And then at that point, if there is an attack, usually about 5 to 10 minutes later, you'll get the actual air siren. So that'll blare in the air. You'll get, your alert through an app. And then you have 90 seconds to get inside if you're in Tel Aviv. If you're in the north, you might have less time. Or if you're in the south, you might have less time. Depends where the missiles are coming from, right? So we saw this. And we all knew that this means that there's war with Iran, and everyone went to their bomb shelters, whichever one was nearby, and it was orderly. Everyone just walked there because they know the drill. This is nothing new to them. And I went to a garage, and then after 2 or 3 minutes, people began to leave because they realized that the alert indicated that Israel had attacked Iran, but not that there was a counterattack. So they said, okay, we're just going to go home, we're going to rest, we're going to prepare, and then if there's an attack, we'll go back to the shelter. And so I then went back, and the city was beginning to empty. There weren't that many people on the streets. Things were deserted. And I saw some people, with their luggage, and they were traveling to the north of Israel or to the south of Israel in rural areas that are less likely to be targeted by Iran, because Tehran likes to predominantly target Tel Aviv and Haifa. They don't target Jerusalem so much because of all of the historical and religious sites, but of course Tel Aviv is a newer city, and same with Haifa, so they want to destroy those, right? So people got out of there. There were some moderate lines at the nearby grocery store, but it was nothing insane. Maybe about 5 or 6 people deep. Everyone, once again, was very calm, and they were getting some extra food, but for the most part, there was no hoarding. So then, shortly afterwards, maybe 1 or 2 hours, we got another emergency alerts, and so we thought, okay, well, this is going to be the retaliation. So you go to your bomb shelter, whichever one's nearby. They're everywhere here. It's ubiquitous. And then we got the follow-up siren. And that was anxiety-inducing the first 1 or 2 times. But by 4 or 5 p.m., we did this 7 or 8 times, right? And after a while, your anxiety dissipates and it's replaced with a sense of tedium, right? This becomes a chore. And the fact that it is allowed to become a chore, that is perceived as a chore, is a testament to the strength of the IDF, because people didn't feel afraid. People still don't feel afraid. They know that the infrastructure is there to protect them and that there's an organized system in place that ensures that they have agency over their own safety and they have time to get to a shelter should they need to. Now, one thing I do want to clarify is that if you are in a shelter and you get a direct hit, so a missile lands directly on it, there's nothing you can do. You're dead at that point. But statistically speaking, the chance of that happening is very remote. It's on par with being hit by a car, if not rarer than that. So people understand that. Uh, so after the first day, we didn't sleep. There were lots of alerts throughout the night. People were getting tired. But by Sunday, things were beginning to lighten up. By Monday, things were starting to feel more normal. And so today, when we're recording this, we've had some alerts over the course of the day, maybe 5 or 6, but you just go to the shelter, you wait 10 minutes, 15 minutes, and then you go out. And last night was particularly tough because we had an alert at 2 a.m., 3 a.m., and 4 a.m., so no one slept. But you don't have a sense of terror. You just go to the shelter and you come back. It's just that you can't sleep because you have to follow instructions. So the mood in the city is relaxed. There isn't really any panic here. It's less severe than the 12-day war. And I hypothesize, and I think that many people believe this, it seems to be the general consensus, is that Iran, decided to attack all of the Arab Gulf states. Their gamble essentially was that these states are softer targets than anything in Israel. They don't have the infrastructure, they don't have all the bomb shelters, they never expected to be assaulted this way. And the idea is to pressure the Gulf states to run to the United States and beg for negotiations. That hasn't worked out. But what that means is that Iran's attacks are dispersed across a large number of countries. The UAE has absorbed the bulk of the attacks, and Israel is being left relatively alone. We still have a few hits, but they're really not that severe, and most of the city is totally normal.
Okay, so since you were there for the 12-day war. Of course, you've been back and forth to Canada. You've monitored the geopolitics. I'm sure you were plugged into, the debates in Israel. Can you give a sense of, from the Israeli perspective, what has changed between the 12-day war and this current, dual-pronged attack from the U.S. and Israel? I mean, in terms of what does the society believe about justification? And I will add that, for the worldwide viewer, for anyone that missed that in the interim, there was a revolt in Iran and about 30,000 or more Iranian citizens were killed. Surely that comes into the humanitarian understanding as well. But let's focus on the Israeli perspective, war justification.
Well, from my understanding, about 80% of Israelis support attacking Iran. They all love Iranian people. I just want to clarify. Israelis love Iranians and view them as sophisticated and educated, and Iranians seem to really love Israelis. There's actually this big cultural bromance. But Israelis understand that the Islamic regime is apocalyptic and views itself as being sees itself as being a crusader against the existence of Israel, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the Islamic regime uh, is not a rational geopolitical actor. It wants to eradicate Israel as a little Satan and then eradicate the United States. And so for many Israelis, they view conflict with the Islamic regime as inevitable.
Mm-hmm.
And they say, look, it's better to strike them now than later when they become invulnerable. Now, there was, of course, the 12-day war. The Israelis attacked Iran and tried to destroy their nuclear capabilities. The United States came in at the very end, provided some help, and then kind of said, okay, mission over. And although Trump boasted that they had done significant damage to Iran's nuclear facilities, in Israel, the perception was that the war was not prosecuted as to its full extent and that most of Iran's nuclear capabilities survived and that they could be rebuilt. So that was a concern. Now, the underlying issue here is that in addition to building its nuclear capacities, Iran has invested a lot of money into building thousands of ballistic missiles. And what that means is that Iran, with those ballistic missiles, can engage in hostage diplomacy. If you try to attack Iran, Iran can say, well, we will destroy Tel Aviv using our conventional weapons, and we will, destroy the Gulf states as well. And so it seems as if the Islamic regime was gambling on this, and they thought, okay, we will build a ballistic missile shield. The cost of interfering with our foreign policy will be too high for anyone to bear. And then we will use that to provide ourselves with enough cover to build a nuclear weapon when we need to. And of course, neither Israel nor the United States was willing to let that happen. They knew that there was a window of opportunity to topple the regime or cripple the regime before it became too strong. Now, with the 12-Day War having somewhat failed, I think the question was, when is the next war with Iran going to happen? That was seen as inevitable within Israel. And then we saw an opportunity open because, first of all, there was an economic crisis. So one of Iran's main banks collapsed in the autumn, and the governments responded to that by printing more money, and then that instigated hyperinflation. And then those economic problems, tied with long-standing political discontent, sparked the mass anti-government protests that we saw beginning in December and crescendoing in January. And then the Islamic regime responded to that by murdering about 30,000 protesters, spilling rivers of blood. And the Islamic regime already has very weak and fragile regime legitimacy that shattered it, and of course created a volcanic reservoir of discontent that I think any foreign actor would see as an asset, right? If you want to topple a regime, you probably want to do it when most of the population is pissed off because you've massacred 30,000 people. So all of these factors came into play. Plus, of course, there's the water crisis in Tehran/Iran, which makes things even more vulnerable and fraught. And so it seemed obvious to do it now. And what's interesting is that there was actually symbolic value to when the Americans and the Israelis launched this attack, because they launched it on the weekend of Purim. Purim is a Jewish holiday, and it commemorates this historical event ages and ages ago in antiquity, where the Jews were living under the Persians, and there was some Persian administrator, policymaker, high-powered guy, and he was offended by a Jew. There was some kind of conflict. And so he decided that the solution to this was to murder all of the Jews in the Persian Empire at the time, because I guess he was being melodramatic. And unbeknownst to him, the queen of Persia at the time was secretly Jewish. She had hid her Judaism previously. And so she had to make a choice whether or not to reveal herself as a Jew to her husband and beg for the freedom of her people, beg for them to be spared. And so she did the brave thing. She spoke to her husband, and he sided with her. And the high-leveled guy, Hamad, I believe is his name. So he was then, I think he was executed or something like that. So what you have here is a story where the Jews faced annihilation from the bad Persians and then were saved by the good Persians. So you can see some historical parallels. And I don't think the decision to launch the war on this weekend was an accident.
This is the biblical story of Esther, right?
Yes.
So it's interesting that the the geopolitics go back to the Bible age, and that you say kinship between the peoples. We even see it a little bit in modern, spy dramas like Tehran. But I guess what I want to ask is, you're located where you can get probably an even better sense of that people to people understanding. It seems to me, if you're telling me that, it almost seems to feel like the Israeli population, I'm sure they're not being overly optimistic or hopeful, but they feel that this is in hand. And it seems that's what we're getting from the US military. Uh, Despite any disinformation coming from the Iran regime, this appears to be a conflict that will be mass destruction. Assets for the Iranian regime will be crushed. So, what happens after that, if that is true? Do you think it could be a story where there could be democracy in Iran? Are the constituents there?
It's hard to tell. So, yeah, right now in Israel, everyone feels very confident. And before I answer your question, I just want to make a point about online disinformation, because this
Hmm.
is something that happened last summer too. Last summer, during the 12-Day War, the Israelis and the Americans eventually kicked the Islamic regime's ass. And rather than deal with this reality, the Islamic regime supporters began to spread disinformation claiming that large parts of Tel Aviv had been destroyed.
Yeah.
And a lot of this disinformation was AI generated. I saw a lot of it, and it was really bizarre for me as someone who was in Tel Aviv to hear people say, "Oh, Tel Aviv has, been razed to the ground." And I look around and I said, "No, it's not." And then I went to the beach and I made a video and I said, I'm on the beach of Tel Aviv, everything is fine. And then they said I was doing AI generated content. So the same thing happened this year.
Yeah.
Things are fine. We have a few strikes, right? We've had a few impacts, and those impacts are not pretty, but that is a very small portion of the city, right? And so now we have all this AI generated content, including a video that came out 2 or 3 days ago that showed all of these missiles landing in the city, and that was all fake. And and that's giving people the wrong impression. And once again, I'm finding myself having to tell people, "Hey, I'm in Tel Aviv. This is a lie," and they don't believe me. Now, there are two main factors here for this disinformation. Then I'll go and answer your question. So, factor one is, of course, there are state-based disinformation agents. The Islamic regime, of course, spends a lot of money in maintaining bot farms, and they have their useful idiots as well. And then on top of that, you have this monetization structure in social media that incentivizes bad
Hmm.
actors.
Yeah.
Because, right, if you get a lot of clicks and then you get paid based on your engagement because you're getting a portion of that ad revenue, then there's a business model here where you can just post a whole bunch of outrageous AI generated war propaganda that gives you a lot of attention and you make money off of that and you're spreading disinformation. I mean, this is nothing new. Back in 2016, when we saw the first rise of politicized social media disinformation, you had a group of Macedonian teenagers who created websites saying that Hillary Clinton drinks children's blood and runs pedophile rings out of, a pizza parlor. And they made a shit ton of money off of that. So this is the same thing, but it's all on social media. So X is now trying to stop that by demonetizing those accounts. Now, to go back to your earlier question about what is the prospect of democracy
Hmm.
in Iran, well, I think it's going to be tough. And much of the Iranian diaspora, the overwhelming majority, has consolidated around exiled Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi.
Yeah.
So, he's the son of the Shah who was deposed. And for many decades, no one took Pahlavi seriously at all. He was known as the Clown Prince. He was just kind of living a life of dissipation in the United States. And he had some support from a hardcore group of monarchists, but that was it. Then, starting a few years ago, he began to take his role more seriously and he began to work with Iranian civil society actors. And they put together something known as the Iranian Prosperity Project, which is a transition plan for what it would look like after the Islamic regime falls. And Pahlavi began to present himself as a transitional figure. He says, "Look, I'm not here to be my father. I'm not here to install a new dictatorship. I am here to stabilize the country for a period of 1 to 3 years and guide it towards a national referendum that would be democratic in nature. We decide what the essential essence of our new state looks like." That transition plan won over a lot of skeptics. And then as people consolidated around Pahlavi, the remaining people who didn't support him said, "Well, you know what? We've never seen everyone so divided. I have my concerns, but I'm going to reluctantly support Pahlavi because I know that he's the only one who can unite the Iranians." So that is true of the diaspora. The
Hmm.
question is, how true is this of Iran itself? How many Iranians in Iran support Pahlavi? It seems evident that there is a big base of support, but is it enough for Pahlavi to dislodge all of the entrenched systems of the Islamic regime? And of course, the Islamic regime, it rules by brutality, but it does have some base of support that you don't see in the diaspora, because people who are in the diaspora are the people who fled because they didn't like Islamic fanaticism. So that is the question. Trump has suggested that he might not back Pahlavi because there might be a lack of domestic support, and that he might, for example, elevate a pre-existing regime figure in the same way that he worked with the, I think, deputy prime minister or vice president of Venezuela.
In Venezuela. Yeah. Rodriguez.
Yeah, yeah. So in this way, he'd be prioritizing stability over rapid democratic change, which has its pros and cons, but I think would be dissatisfying to most Iranians.
Hmm.
And that's an option, right? But then he's also said that it's hard for him to figure out who could replace the current leaders because so many of his candidates have been killed through
Hmm.
American strikes.
Yeah, a lot of military success that's hard to deny. So, one thing that I've covered, and I see more and more coverage in, let's say, mainstream analysis, is I think people in the United States are starting to realize that actually China is a part of the equation, even if the White House or the Joint Chief Chair can't say this is about China. From my perspective, it's at least part of the equation, and I can say that in a sort of Chatham House conversation quite recently, I heard an Israeli official say quite openly, yes, we in Israel know that Iran and China are joined at the hip and they're part of a sort of alliance that is on the other side of the US and Israel. So is that coming up let's just call it mainstream debate in Israel at this point?
Yeah, I mean it's all pretty self-evident. We know that there's this authoritarian bloc consisting of China, Iran, North Korea, Russia, and they all don't like the West. They all don't like Israel, and they're working to thwart the West. So of course it makes sense to attack them as a unified bloc rather than to see these conflicts as individual theaters that have nothing to do with each other, right? Um, so that is generally understood. And I think for many Israelis, at least the ones who I talk to, they say, of course, it makes sense for the United States to get involved because some people will say, well, why does it matter to the United States if Iran is a hostile force? It's all the way in the Middle East. Well, the Israelis say, well, we have to look at things holistically, right? This is a new Cold War. This is one of the main players in this new Cold War. You've got to knock them out.
Yeah, and on that point, I mean, how long do you think it goes? Are you getting a sense President Trump has said 4 to 5 weeks, something like that? Do you get a sense from the Israeli media how long it could go, and if the people are could be in for the longer haul, or if they could see boots on the ground? What are those debates in Israeli culture?
No one is quite sure of how long this will last. There's a lot of uncertainty, but everyone is in this for the long haul. They view any harm that they experience as a necessary sacrifice. I mean, Israelis were behind this war even when it seemed as if Tel Aviv was going to receive significant damage. So at this point, with everything mostly being fine outside, I think that they're okay to let this drag out a little bit, right? And uh, and I don't think many Israelis I think are uncomfortable with the idea of not following through. They don't want to create a situation where the Islamic regime recuperates and then we have to go through this entire process again and again and again.
Yeah, and kind of related to a prior question, is there recognition within the Israeli culture that it's part of that debate, perhaps disinformation online? Even a lot of American influencers are saying Israelis wagging the dog. That's why President Trump has gone in.
Israelis are aware of the fact that there is an enormous amount of disinformation about around them in the world. And there's frustration within Israel, but at the same time, there's almost a sense of resignation because what can you do after a while? When you're facing off against opponents who are willing to lie uh, so shamelessly and so frequently, then after a certain point, you just have to put your head down and continue doing your work and hope for the best. Uh, and I know that maybe there are some people who are watching this who might think that this disinformation is correct. And I really got to emphasize, like, if you talk to any Israeli, you kind of realize how ridiculous it is. I'll give you an example of this. So there there are some people who are pushing this narrative, for example, that uh, Israeli bomb shelters are not welcoming of non-white people. And this is a propaganda point that is specifically designed to activate far left anger towards Israel, basically by portraying Israel as a white supremacist state, even though 50% of Israelis are Middle Eastern because they're Middle Eastern Jews. And so I'm in this bizarre situation where now when I go to the bomb shelters, you know, you often see people of color. It's a very multiracial society. So I'll be like, hey, do you guys want to do an interview? And I'll photograph people, interview them, put them online. But it's like taking a teaspoon of water and throwing it on a giant fire, right? And I think many Israelis feel the same way. You just, there are so many different ways that this country is lied about that it's impossible to address.
Yeah, and I would add that I think it's becoming more clear that they call it the horseshoe phenomenon. So you could have an influencer on the far right, on the far left, both making the same points. They've got 2 million followers. They saying Iran is winning, or they're saying Israel is driving US into the war. And people should recognize they're getting paid with clicks and like direct transfers from, or essentially, regimes. We don't need to name them. We'll be able to sort of make sure that funds flow into whatever their account is on social media that's monetized when they say things like that. And those people aren't dumb, so they see funds flowing in. I'm going to say the same thing again.
I mean, we can name the regime. The regime here is Qatar, right? So Qatar, despite only having 300,000 people, has an enormous amount of money, and they've spent enormous sums on disinformation and vilification campaigns in Israel. Attacking Israel. So we know they've put a lot of money into North American academia. We know that they fund bot accounts, and we know that Qatar, for example, hosts the leaders of Hamas. And they're not a friend, they're an enemy, although they try to pretend to be friends. They've offered, for example, to host, and they do currently host an American base on their property because they see this as protection against the Islamic regime. They're trying to play both sides. But they're a threat to our information environment. And this is actually where I think that the Islamic regime really messed up because they attacked Qatar. They bombed Doha on top of bombing Dubai and all these other places. And now I think the question is, will Qatar be as willing to give propaganda support and to attack Israel when you have Israeli forces essentially protecting Qataris from Iranian bombs?
Mm-hmm.
So hopefully this will change their disposition, and this might lead to a less messed up information environment.
Right. Okay, so we've covered the kinetic war, the information war. Adam, just tell us how long you plan to be there and what do you see the next few weeks for yourself?
Well, I was supposed to be here until March 13th, and I had a sense that this wasn't going to actually happen. And so Air Canada did cancel my flights, and they have tentatively rescheduled it for March 27th, so that's 2 weeks afterwards. So I guess I might come back at the end of the month. If not, I might just stay longer. I do hope to be back in Canada by early April because I have some other things to do here. But yeah, I mean, I might just stay here for a while. And in terms of what my next few weeks look like, it's not as exciting as you would think because once again, the Iranians are so incompetent and the United States has crippled them. So it's mostly me just going to bomb shelters and talking to people and interviewing policy experts when we're not being interrupted by the sirens and then sitting at cafes and writing. So I don't know, maybe I could go to Gaza and have a contact who could maybe arrange that. But my life is basically just the life of any writer, except I have to run to a basement maybe 5 times a day.
All right. Well, Adam, always appreciate your contributions to the Bureau. Just let us know where people can find your coverage on this campaign and elsewhere.
Well, I mean, you can find me on social media, on X, on TikTok, on Facebook, on Instagram, and on all of these platforms. It's Adam Zivo, Z-I-V as in Victor O, and I'm there. Twitter's where I'm most active. I started doing a lot of short-term content on Instagram, though. So yeah, if you want to learn more about me, you can go there, or you can read all of my stuff at the National Post. I'm one of their columnists, and I'm kind of their foreign affairs guy. So it's all there too.
All right, Adam, take care, and we will be in touch again.
Wow.